January 17th, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed with 1,000 invisible mouths. Steam rose from black soil, still wet with yesterday's monsoon, curling through the canopy where sunlight died before touching ground. In a crater 20 meters wide, carved fresh by naval artillery 3 nights prior, 7 American Marines huddled beneath a canopy of shredded palm fronds and canvas shelter halves. The air tasted of cordite, rotting vegetation, and the sweet, sick smell of death that had become as common as breathing. Corporal Michael Donnelly, 22 years old from Cleveland, Ohio, sat with his back against the crater's muddy wall. A dented can of something called meat and beans balanced on his knee. Around him, his squad, men whose names had become more real than the families they'd left behind, waited in that peculiar state between vigilance and exhaustion that defined every waking moment on this island. Above them, in the dense green cathedral of the jungle, something else waited too. Japanese snipers, invisible as smoke, patient as stone, watching through the spaces between leaves for any movement, any mistake, any target. Then the first mortar shell whistled overhead. The sound was unmistakable. That rising scream that turned every muscle to wire, every instinct to flight. It landed 40 meters east, throwing black earth and splintered wood skyward in a column of violence. The second followed within heartbeats, then a third. The Japanese had found their range, and now they were walking fire across American positions with methodical precision. This was how men died on Guadalcanal, not in glorious charges, but huddled in holes while mathematics and trajectory did their indifferent work. And in that moment, as the fourth shell shrieked toward them, Private First Class Johnny Martinez did something that should have been impossible. He laughed, not a nervous giggle or a hysterical break, but a genuine, full-throated laugh that cut through the screaming air like a blade through silk. Then Donnelly joined him. Then Sergeant Hayes. Within seconds, the entire squad was laughing, howling. Actually, as shells continued to rain down around their position, each explosion close enough to feel the pressure waves slam against their chests, to taste the displaced earth in their teeth. 300 meters away, concealed in a carefully constructed sniper's nest 30 feet above the jungle floor, Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army pressed his eye against the scope of his Type 97 sniper rifle and felt something inside him break that had nothing to do with fear. He had been fighting Americans for 4 months now. He had killed 11 of them, each death recorded in his personal diary with the date, time, and distance. He understood their tactic, their weapons, their patterns. But this laughter in the face of incoming fire, this he could not understand at all. His hands, trained to steadiness that could hold a sight picture through a heartbeat, began to tremble. To understand what happened in that crater on Guadalcanal, one must first understand what the Japanese soldier believed about himself and his enemy. The education of the Imperial Japanese Army was not merely military training, it was ideological construction. From the moment a young man received his conscription papers, the red ticket that transformed him from civilian to soldier, he entered a system designed to remake him into something beyond individual humanity. He became a fragment of the Emperor, a cell in the divine body of Yamato spirit, the living embodiment of Bushido values that stretched back through centuries of warrior tradition. The training was brutal by design. At camps across Japan, recruits endured systematic brutalization intended to destroy civilian softness and forge military hardness. Senior soldiers beat junior ones without cause or explanation. Food was deliberately insufficient. Sleep was interrupted at random intervals. Physical exercise extended past exhaustion into collapse. Officers screamed that the recruit was worthless, shameful, a disgrace to his family and ancestors. The message embedded itself through repetition and pain. The individual was nothing. The unit was everything. Death was preferable to dishonor. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was engineering. The Japanese military understood something that Western armies of the era still debated. that men do not naturally want to kill other men, do not naturally stand in the face of annihilating fire. Nature must be overridden by culture, and culture must be enforced by training so severe that instinct itself is rewritten. A Japanese soldier learned to charge machine gun positions not despite his survival instinct, but because that instinct had been systematically destroyed and replaced with something else. The terror of failing his brothers, his family, his nation, his emperor, his ancestors reaching back through the ages. Death became the lesser fear, and they were taught about their enemies. The Americans, they learned, were soft, corrupted by democracy and individualism, weakened by material abundance and racial mixing, spiritually hollow from worship of money rather than honor. The Japanese soldier was told that Americans could not endure hardship, could not accept sacrifice, would break and retreat when faced with true warriors willing to die for their cause. This was not mere propaganda. It was religious doctrine. The Americans had factories and ships and numbers, yes, but they lacked spirit, they lacked soul. And spirit, the Japanese soldier learned, would triumph over mere materialism. Takeshi Yamamoto had believed this absolutely when he landed on Guadalcanal in October 1942. He was 19 years old, the son of a rice farmer from Kumamoto Prefecture. He could recite the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors from memory. He had written his death poem before boarding the transport ship, accepting that he would not return home. He carried no expectation of survival, only of duty fulfilled. His life belonged to the emperor, and its expenditure was already decided. There was a fierce comfort in that certainty, a freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. But Guadalcanal taught him things that ideology could not answer. The American soldiers who landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942 were not, in fact, the soft civilians of Japanese propaganda. Many were, however, desperately young and frantically underprepared. The 1st Marine Division that hit the beaches had trained in its final form for less than a year. Some men had never thrown a live grenade before combat. Many had barely qualified with their rifles. They came from a nation that had been at peace for 20 years, whose military had been deliberately kept small, whose economy had only just begun to mobilize for war. They brought with them confusion, fear, uncertainty, and a profound lack of understanding about what they were entering. What they also brought, though no one recognized it as a weapon at the time, was a fundamentally different relationship with their own existence. The American soldier was not taught that his life belonged to the state. He was not broken down and rebuilt as a selfless component of a greater whole. His training was harsh, yes, but it remained bounded by rules, by law, by the persistent belief that individual life retained inherent value. He was told he could win and go home. He was encouraged to write letters, to maintain connection with the civilian identity he would eventually resume. He was fed substantially, regularly, predictably. His supply system, while imperfect, operated on the assumption that material abundance was a right of those who served. Even in combat, even on Guadalcanal, where supply lines barely functioned for the first desperate months, the American soldier received more food, more ammunition, more medical care than his Japanese counterpart could imagine. Most importantly, he retained humor, not as frivolity, but as survival mechanism, as cultural armor, as defiance. The official U.S. Marine Corps records from Guadalcanal contain dozens of incidents of what psychiatrists would later recognize as adaptive humor under stress, jokes in foxholes, pranks during lulls in fighting, irreverent songs sung during marches through jungle that might hide snipers at any moment. To the Marines themselves, this was simply how you stayed sane. You laughed at the absurdity because the absurdity was too large to fight with seriousness alone. You mocked death because to fear it constantly would paralyze you. You found comedy in horror because comedy was a kind of control, a way of asserting that you remained human even when everything around you had descended into mechanized slaughter. To Takeshi Yamamoto, watching through his rifle scope, it looked like insanity. The shelling that day lasted 11 minutes. The Japanese 75mm guns, positioned in the hills above Henderson Field, were operating on minimal ammunition and maximum desperation. By January 1943, the battle for Guadalcanal was already lost. The Japanese High Command simply hadn't accepted the fact yet. Their supply lines had been systematically destroyed by American air and naval power. Their soldiers were starving, dying of malnutrition and tropical disease at rates that exceeded combat losses. The island they had once controlled with casual brutality had become their prison and their graveyard. But they still had gunners, and those gunners still had shells, and every shell might kill Americans. And killing Americans was the only purpose left that made sense of the dying. The Marines in the crater knew this calculus from the receiving end. They knew that the Japanese would fire until they ran out of ammunition or until American counter-battery fire found them. They knew that moving during the barrage increased their chance of dying, that staying still was their best probability of survival. That probability itself was just mathematics dancing with chaos. They knew that they were, in this moment, completely without control over whether they lived or died. The shells fell where they fell. The fragments flew where they flew. You were hit or you weren't, and the difference was measured in inches, in angles, in the incomprehensible math of ballistics and chance. This knowledge, this absolute understanding of powerlessness, was why they laughed. Corporal Donnelly, pressed against mud that might become his grave, clutched his can of meat and beans and found himself thinking about a carnival he'd gone to when he was 12. There had been a ride that spun you in circles while rising and falling, and he'd been terrified and exhilarated simultaneously, and the memory suddenly seemed perfectly relevant. This was the same. You were on the ride. You couldn't get off. You might as well enjoy the absurdity. $5, says the next one, lands in the crater. Private Martinez shouted over the noise. You're on! Sergeant Hayes shouted back. My money's on 30 meters north. The shell landed 40 meters south. They both laughed harder. This was not bravado, though it looked like courage from outside. This was not even conscious strategy. This was the eruption of something deeper than training. A cultural immune response to existential terror. Where the Japanese soldier had been taught to accept death and merge his identity into collective purpose, the American soldier retained stubborn individuality even in the face of annihilation. The laughter was assertion, I am still here. I am still myself. You have not reduced me to merely a target. I remain human enough to find humor in horror. And it worked. Not as protection against shells. Those remained indifferent to morale, but as inoculation against the spiritual death that preceded physical death. The men who laughed in the crater stayed functional. Their hands stayed steady. Their minds stayed clear. When the shelling finally stopped and the inevitable infantry probe came, they fought with the sharp focus of men still connected to life, rather than the numb desperation of those already lost. Takeshi Yamamoto did not participate in the probe that followed the barrage. Snipers operated independently, and his orders were to remain in position and eliminate targets of opportunity. He had ammunition for 12 more shots. After that, his rifle would become a club, and he would become just another starving infantryman waiting for the end. He watched the American position for 3 hours after the laughter. He watched them check equipment, redistribute ammunition, tend to a man who'd been wounded by fragments. Not killed, just wounded, which meant they had medical supplies, which meant their logistics still functioned, which meant they were winning. He watched them eat. Actually eat. They had food, multiple types of food. They opened cans with casual ease, the kind of ease that came from abundance so reliable you didn't even think about it. In his nest, Yamamoto chewed on a ball of rice mixed with barley that constituted his daily ration. It was barely enough to keep a man standing, let alone fighting. His unit had been on reduced rations for 6 weeks. Before that, they'd been on half rations for 2 months, which meant they were now operating on something like 1/4 of what a fighting man needed. Men were dying of simple starvation. Others were dying of beriberi, of dysentery, of infections that their weakened bodies couldn't fight. The jungle was full of Japanese soldiers too weak to patrol, too sick to fight, waiting in hidden positions for death or rescue that would never come. This was the secret that no one had told him. that ideology could not prepare him for, that modern war was not primarily about courage or spirit, but about logistics. The Americans could laugh amid shell fire because they had eaten breakfast, because they knew more food would come tomorrow, because their supply system, however imperfect, operated on assumptions of abundance rather than scarcity. They were not individually braver or more spiritually prepared for death. They were simply better fed, better equipped, and embedded in a material reality that treated their survival as valuable rather than expendable. Yamamoto thought about the last letter he'd received from home, now 3 months old. His mother had written about the rice harvest, about his younger sister's school performance, about normal life continuing in a world that seemed impossibly distant. He had written back. The letter still waited in his pack, unsent, because there was no mail service anymore, and told her that he was fighting with honor, that he would bring pride to the family name, that she should not worry. He had not told her that he was hungry all the time now, that he had watched friends die of starvation, that the Americans they were supposed to defeat seemed to grow stronger while the Japanese army withered, that he had begun to doubt not his own courage, but the fundamental premises he'd been taught about spiritual power, overcoming material advantage. He had not told her that he had heard Americans laughing, and the sound had frightened him more than their artillery. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese survivors of Guadalcanal in their later testimonies was not a weapon. It was a can. The American C-ration and K-ration, those ubiquitous containers of processed food that American soldiers complained about endlessly, became emblems of an enemy they couldn't match. Japanese soldiers scavenged them from American positions, from supply dumps, from the bodies of dead Marines. They prized them beyond their caloric value. A captured can of American rations represented not just food, but an entire system, an economy, an industrial capacity that could package and ship protein and calories to the far side of the world as casually as the Japanese army could barely supply rice. Letters and diaries from Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal, recovered after the battle, return again and again to American food. They describe it with mixture of envy and incomprehension. How could a nation produce such abundance? How could they transport it so reliably? What did it mean that the Americans fed their soldiers meat regularly, multiple times per day, as if meat were not a luxury, but an expectation? One diary entry, written by a Lieutenant Yoshida who died of malnutrition in February 1943, records finding an American dump site, discarded cans everywhere, some still half full. They threw away food, threw it away. My men and I gathered what we could. We ate from garbage and felt grateful. How do you fight an enemy who treats garbage better than your command treats soldiers? This was the revelation that ideology could not process, that American material abundance was not weakness, but overwhelming strength, that a society wealthy enough to give every soldier cigarettes, candy, chewing gum, and coffee, luxuries beyond imagination to the starving Japanese, was a society that could simply outlast and outfight an opponent no matter how brave, how disciplined, how willing to die that opponent might be. The laughter began to make terrible sense. The Americans could laugh because they were not desperate. They were uncomfortable, certainly. They were in danger, absolutely. But they were not abandoned. They were not forgotten. They were part of a system that, however slowly and imperfectly, would continue to feed and supply and reinforce them. They could afford the psychological luxury of humor, because their material needs were met enough that their minds remained flexible rather than narrowed to pure survival. The battle for Guadalcanal officially ended on February 9, 1943, when the last Japanese forces evacuated the island under cover of darkness. Of the approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who fought on Guadalcanal, 14,000 died in combat. Another 9,000 died of disease and starvation. The survivors who were evacuated were skeletal, many unable to walk unassisted, most requiring months of hospitalization to recover basic function. American casualties were 7,100 dead and missing, 7,789 wounded. The statistical disparity told a story beyond tactics. The Americans had lost men to bullets and shells and disease, certainly, but they had not lost them to administrative abandonment. They had not sent soldiers into jungle combat with quarter rations and no medical supplies and called it strategy. They had fought within a logistics system that, while strained to breaking in the early months, never completely failed. More crucially, when the battle turned against them, they could have retreated and regrouped. The Japanese could not. For the Imperial Japanese Army, retreat was ideologically impossible until it became physically unavoidable. Takeshi Yamamoto was among the evacuees. He survived the war, returned to Kumamoto Prefecture in late 1945, and lived until 1987. In a 1978 interview conducted by the Senshi Sosho Military History Project, he spoke about Guadalcanal. The interviewer asked what he remembered most vividly from the battle. Yamamoto did not mention combat. He did not describe the charge he participated in or the Americans he killed. He said this: "I remember hearing them laugh. We were starving and they were laughing. Not mocking us. They didn't even know we were there. Just laughing, like men who believed they would live. I realized then that we had already lost. Not the battle, the war. Because we had been taught that spirit could defeat materialism, but spirit cannot defeat food. Spirit cannot defeat a society so rich it sends cigarettes to the front. I killed Americans on Guadalcanal, but I never stopped hearing their laughter. It was the sound of men who believed the world would continue tomorrow. We had been told not to believe in tomorrow. That was the difference, the phenomenon that psychiatrists and military historians would later document extensively: the superior mental resilience of American forces compared to their Axis counterparts had roots deeper than national character. It emerged from systemic differences in how societies treated their soldiers, which reflected how societies understood the relationship between individual and state. The American military operated within a cultural framework that valued individual survival. This was not sentimentality, but practical calculation born from democratic governance. Soldiers were citizens temporarily in uniform, and they would return to being citizens afterward. They had families and communities that expected their return. They were told, repeatedly and officially, that their lives mattered, that casualties should be minimized, that victory was not worth infinite cost. Even the training manuals reflected this. American doctrine emphasized combined arms, supporting fire, tactical flexibility, all methods that substituted firepower and coordination for raw human sacrifice. The Japanese military operated within an entirely different paradigm. The soldier was not a citizen temporarily serving, but a permanent offering to the state. His death was not tragedy, but fulfillment. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, which every Japanese serviceman memorized, stated explicitly, "Duty is weightier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather." This was not metaphor. It was literal instruction. Your life had less value than correct performance of obligation. Tactics reflected this calculus. Banzai charges, suicide attacks, defense to the last man. These were not desperation moves, but logical outcomes of a system that had no mechanism for strategic withdrawal, because withdrawal implied valuing soldier survival over mission completion. When these two systems collided on islands across the Pacific, the outcome was inevitable. Not in any single battle. Tactical skill and courage could produce Japanese victories, but in sustained campaign, the Americans could retreat, regroup, learn, adapt, and return stronger. The Japanese had to win immediately or die trying. There was no institutional pathway between victory and annihilation, and the men within these systems felt the difference in their bones. The American soldier who laughed amid shell fire was not braver than his Japanese counterpart. He was simply operating within a system that told him his survival was possible and valuable, which allowed his mind to remain flexible enough to find humor in horror. The Japanese soldier could not laugh because he had been systematically taught that his survival did not matter, which meant psychological flexibility itself became a kind of betrayal. There is a recording preserved in the U.S. National Archives, made by a combat correspondent in February 1943, just after Guadalcanal was secured. He was interviewing Marines who had been on the island for the entire campaign. The tape is scratchy, barely audible in parts, but one exchange remains clear. The correspondent asks a sergeant named Williams what kept him going through the worst moments. Williams pauses for a long time. Then he says, "I don't know. We just kept making each other laugh, I guess. Stupid jokes. Terrible jokes. But when you can make your buddy laugh while you're sitting in a hole waiting for mortars, it feels like winning. Like they can blow the jungle to pieces, but they can't blow up the fact that we're still us. You know? Still guys from Brooklyn and Texas and wherever, still thinking the whole thing is crazy, still going to go home and tell stories about it someday. The laughing was how we remembered we were going home. This was the weapon the Japanese army had no counter for. The stubborn insistence that individual life would continue after war. The Americans fought hard, but they fought as men temporarily at war who expected to eventually be at peace. The Japanese fought harder, but they fought as men for whom peace was already irrelevant, whose training had severed the connection between present action and future continuation. Paradoxically, the men who believed they would survive fought more effectively than the men who had accepted death. Not because survival belief made them braver. Courage was abundant on both sides, but because it made them smarter. A soldier who expects to live through the battle makes different tactical decisions. He takes necessary risks, but avoids unnecessary ones. He fights to win rather than simply to kill or die. He maintains equipment because he'll need it tomorrow. He stays connected to his unit because he'll serve with them next week. He adapts to changing circumstances because circumstances matter when you have a future. The Japanese soldiers' acceptance of death, so carefully cultivated through brutal training, backfired strategically. It produced magnificent courage in individual moments. The charges, the last stands, the refusal to surrender that impressed and horrified American observers. But it prevented learning. Dead men cannot report what worked and what failed. Units that fought to annihilation could not preserve institutional knowledge. An army that treated casualties as fulfillment rather than loss had no mechanism for recognizing when casualties exceeded strategic value. In the decades after World War II, as Japan recovered and rebuilt and eventually became an American ally, Japanese scholars began the difficult work of analyzing what had gone wrong. The military histories, the official Senshi Sosho series, documented tactical and strategic failures in meticulous detail. But some Japanese writers dug deeper, examining the ideological foundations that had made such failures inevitable. One of the most searing analyses came from Saburo Yanaga, historian and textbook author, who wrote, "We taught our soldiers to despise their own lives. We called this noble. But what we actually created was a military system that could not learn, could not adapt, and could not acknowledge reality when reality contradicted ideology." The Americans valued their soldiers' lives, not because they were more humanitarian, but because they were more pragmatic. A dead soldier is wasted training, wasted experience, wasted human capital. The Japanese army treated human capital as infinite because we treated individual humans as worthless. This was called Bushido. It was actually suicide. This was the truth that Takeshi Yamamoto had glimpsed through his rifle scope on Guadalcanal, watching Americans laugh amid incoming fire, that the laughter represented a society fundamentally organized around different principles. Not better principles, necessarily, but different. A society that believed individual life had inherent value, that believed comfort and abundance were worth pursuing, that believed war was an interruption of normal life rather than life's highest purpose. These beliefs produced material abundance, which enabled effective logistics, which meant soldiers could be fed and supplied, which meant they could maintain psychological flexibility, which meant they could laugh. The laughter was not cause, but symptom. It was the sound of men embedded in a system that, for all its flaws and inequities and violences, had not severed their connection to the possibility of future normalcy. It was the sound of men who fought to return home rather than to avoid returning home. It was the sound of democracy as practical military advantage. On a spring evening in 1979, Michael Donnelly, now 58 years old, retired from the Cleveland Police Department. Grandfather of 3, sat in his living room and tried to explain Guadalcanal to his grandson, who was writing a school report. The boy wanted to know if Donnelly had been afraid. Donnelly said yes, constantly. The boy wanted to know how he dealt with the fear. Donnelly thought about it for a long time. "We laughed," he finally said. "I know that sounds crazy, but we laughed at everything. The rain, the mud, the food, each other, the situation. We laughed because if we didn't laugh, we'd just be scared all the time. And you can't fight when you're just scared." The laughing wasn't about thinking things were funny. It was about staying ourselves, staying human, remembering that we were more than just targets or killers. We were guys with homes and families and futures. The war was trying to make us forget that. The laughing was how we remembered. The boy asked if the Japanese soldiers laughed. Donnelly said he didn't know. He'd never been close enough to hear. But he remembered the prisoners, the ones captured after the island was secured. He remembered how thin they were, how their eyes looked, not just defeated, but emptied. He remembered one prisoner who had stared at the Marines' evening meal, just standard rations, nothing special, and wept. Not spoke, just wept at the sight of food. Donnelly said it was the only time on Guadalcanal he'd felt truly angry at the Japanese, not at their soldiers, but at whatever system had sent men into battle so undersupplied that a can of hash made them cry. This was the essential asymmetry that decided the Pacific War at the strategic level. Both sides fought with courage. Both sides suffered enormously. Both sides committed atrocities and performed heroism. But only one side operated within a system that treated soldiers as valuable resources to be preserved when possible. Only one side maintained supply lines that delivered not just ammunition, but food, medicine, comfort items. Only one side allowed soldiers to remain psychologically connected to peacetime identity, which paradoxically made them more effective warriors. The Japanese Empire could produce the finest individual soldiers in the world, disciplined, brave, skilled, willing to fight to death. But it could not produce the logistics system that would keep those soldiers fed. It could not produce the strategic flexibility that would preserve those soldiers for future campaigns. Most fundamentally, it could not produce the ideological framework that would allow those soldiers to retreat, learn, and improve without perceiving retreat as spiritual annihilation. And so they fought brilliantly and died uselessly, while their enemy fought pragmatically and survived increasingly. And the gap between ideological purity and practical effectiveness became a grave that swallowed hundreds of thousands of young men who deserved better than being weapons, programmed for self-destruction. The laughter on Guadalcanal was not unique to that battle or that moment. It appeared throughout the American military experience in World War II, in the gallows humor of bomber crews, in the wisecracks of infantrymen in Europe, in the irreverent nicknames soldiers gave to terrible situations. It was not official doctrine. No training manual taught it. It emerged organically, a cultural immune response to industrialized death, a way of maintaining individual humanity amid systematic dehumanization. Military sociologists would later recognize this humor as critical to unit cohesion and individual resilience, but it was only possible because the underlying system permitted it. You cannot laugh if you are starving. The body will not allow that expenditure of energy. You cannot maintain psychological flexibility if you have been systematically broken down and rebuilt as ideological automaton. You cannot stay connected to future possibility if you have been taught that future possibility is spiritual weakness. The American military system, for all its failures and inequities, never completely severed that connection. It never taught soldiers that their lives were expendable. It never made death the highest purpose. It treated war as a problem to be solved through application of resources, including human resources, which meant human resources should be managed efficiently. This produced a military that was often cautious, sometimes slow, occasionally frustrating to more aggressive Allied commanders. But it produced a military that could sustain campaigns, that could learn from defeats, that could grind forward through attrition, because its soldiers believed grinding forward would eventually lead somewhere beyond war. The Japanese military system produced soldiers who could charge machine guns singing the national anthem, But it could not produce soldiers who could retreat from machine guns, analyze why the charge failed, and devise better tactics for tomorrow. Because there was no tomorrow in the Imperial Japanese Army, there was only now, only duty, only the eternal present of service unto death. One system could laugh amid shells. The other could only die amid them with discipline. History recorded which system proved superior. Guadalcanal today is green and quiet. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefields. The airfield that men fought and died for, Henderson Field, named for a Marine pilot killed at Midway, is now Honiara International Airport, serving commercial flights in and out of the Solomon Islands capital. The rusty wreckage of war machines still dots the island, slowly dissolving into oxide and earth. The graves have been moved, the American dead gathered and repatriated or interred in permanent cemeteries, the Japanese remains, those that were found, cremated and returned to families, or enshrined at Yasukuni. The laughter has long since faded into silence. The men who laughed are mostly dead now, claimed by age after surviving war. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren live in a world so distant from 1943 that Guadalcanal seems like mythology rather than history. They cannot imagine the jungle, the fear, the shells, the hunger. They cannot imagine laughing amid any of it, but the laughter mattered, not because it changed any particular battle. Tactics and logistics and firepower did that work. It mattered because it revealed a truth about freedom that ideology cannot articulate, that freedom is not merely political structure or economic system, but the psychological space to remain yourself even when systems try to reduce you to component. The American soldiers on Guadalcanal were not freer than Japanese soldiers in any abstract sense. They were embedded in military hierarchy, subject to orders, conscripted into service. But their system preserved a space, narrow, battered, but real, for individual personality to persist. That space allowed humor, and humor allowed psychological survival. And psychological survival allowed learning and adaptation. And learning and adaptation compounded over time into strategic advantage. The Japanese sniper who heard Americans laughing and felt his certainty shatter understood this intuitively. Even if he could not articulate it, he was hearing the sound of men who had not been fully converted into weapons, who retained connection to something beyond duty and death. He was hearing freedom, not as political abstraction, but as lived experience. Men who could laugh amid horror were men whose spirits had not been entirely colonized by war. They remained, somehow, citizens temporarily in uniform, rather than soldiers permanently in service. And that difference, multiplied across millions of men and hundreds of battles, accumulated into outcome. The shells that fell on Guadalcanal on January 17, 1943, were not different from any other shells. They killed or they didn't according to physics and chance. The men who laughed beneath them were not superhuman. They were terrified and exhausted and desperate to survive. But they laughed because their culture had not taken from them the possibility of laughter, because their system had not taught them that their deaths mattered more than their lives, because they could still imagine, even in that crater with shells screaming overhead, that there would be an after. The Imperial Japanese Army could not imagine after. It had systematically destroyed after in favor of eternal now. It had traded future possibility for present intensity, and in the calculus of total war, that trade proved fatal. This is the lesson that echoes across decades, relevant not just to World War II, but to any system that demands human beings sacrifice individuality for collective purpose, that you cannot build lasting power on the destruction of individual will. You can build spectacular moments, the charges, the sacrifices, the gestures that inspire and horrify, but you cannot sustain campaigns. You cannot adapt to change. You cannot learn from failure. Because all of those things require humans who retain enough psychological flexibility to imagine alternatives, which requires them to remain human enough to imagine survival, which requires them to maintain connection to self that transcends immediate duty. The laughter on Guadalcanal was not triumph. It was not even resistance in any conscious sense. It was simply persistence, the persistence of personality against systematic erasure. It was the sound of democracy as lived experience rather than political theory. It was proof that freedom is not merely the absence of oppression, but the presence of psychological space for self to remain coherent even amid chaos. And against all the courage, discipline, and sacrifice that the Imperial Japanese Army could marshal, against all the ideological certainty and spiritual purity and willingness to die, that small space, that capacity to laugh at the absurd while living through the terrible, proved to be the weapon that mattered most. Not in any single moment, not in any individual battle, but across time, across campaigns, across the slow, grinding arithmetic of war, the men who could laugh outlasted the men who could only die with honor. The shells fell equally on both, but only one side kept laughing, and in the end, that was the sound of victory. Not glorious or noble or particularly heroic, but human and stubborn and ultimately unstoppable. The sound of men who believed, despite all evidence in that moment, that they would live to tell the story. And the telling itself, echoing through decades, became a kind of second victory. The victory of memory over ideology, of individual experience over collective myth, of the simple human insistence on survival over the cultivated belief that death could be nobler than life. The crater on Guadalcanal is gone now, filled in by time and nature. The men who huddled there are mostly bones and memory, but the laughter they managed, impossibly, amid incoming fire, remains as testimony to what humans can preserve even when systems try to turn them into something less than human. That preservation, messy, irreverent, utterly unheroic in the traditional sense, turned out to be the most powerful weapon of all.